In the dying moments of the Nazi regime, they still clung to the belief that a breakthrough could somehow turn the tide. That arrogance drove a Nazi colonel to brazenly defy international convention, massacring American prisoners of war who had already surrendered. And it was in that very moment of shame that the Germans knew they had lost the war. He stepped into the frame like a blade sliding across glass. Joachim Peiper, SS Standartenführer of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. Precise, cold, every movement measured as if by steel rulers. People knew him for speed, for lunging strikes without looking back, and for the cruelty he dealt to those who lost. Born in 1915, he grew up with the empire's fever for power. By his 20s, Peiper had moved into the inner circle of the man second only to Hitler, Heinrich Himmler. Not as some lowly clerk, he was an aide, the quiet shadow just behind his master, watching how orders were turned into action. The trips, the lists, the closed doors. It was there he learned how commands travelled down the nerves of an organisation built to crush. Then he left the desk and returned to the LSSAH, the Führer's bodyguard unit, now an armoured division, carrying with him instincts sharpened to the edge. Give short orders, strike fast, show no mercy. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, LSSAH, stood out in the 6th Panzer Army like a symbol. It began as Hitler's personal guard, protecting his office and residence. From a regiment, it grew into a division, spearheading campaign after campaign. The reputation of the LSSAH bore two faces: iron discipline and absolute loyalty, alongside an early record of alleged war crimes, especially on the Eastern Front. Post-war reports recorded executions of prisoners and civilians tied to its units. Violence came not only from firepower but from clipped orders dropped in the frenzy of moving faster than the map. No need for grand numbers, just look along the path they left. Bridges down, villages burned, people herded into clusters. There, speed outran limits and results outweighed rules. In the Battle of the Ardennes, the 1st SS Panzer Division fought alongside the infamous Hitler Youth Division. That division had been linked to the massacre of 64 Canadian and British prisoners in Normandy. Composed of teenage fighters, some only 16 or 17, the Hitler Youth Division was one of Hitler's most fanatical formations, indoctrinated in Nazi ideology since childhood. Peiper himself soon became a kind of symbol. Handsome, young, glittering with medals, and trailed by a record of campaigns that blurred the line between ruthless tactics and erasure of crimes. Historians such as Westermeyer and Parker described it as a cult of glory, a creed that made brutality seem necessary. From Eastern Europe to Italy, then France, the tracks of his division carried reports that would later fill prosecutors' files. At the command level, he fostered a culture of permission to do what no one dared speak aloud. At the squad level, that turned into action. But that black star was not made to sit in a conference room. In the winter of 1944, the Western Front cracked like breaking ice. Hitler needed a reversal, and the Ardennes was chosen as the chessboard, his last great gamble before collapse. Tear through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse, swing up to Brussels, then slam the lid shut at Antwerp. If that thrust landed, Eisenhower's front would be split in two, with the forces in Holland and Belgium isolated, a dark echo of May 1940. On paper, the spearhead stretched across more than 60 miles of front, from the Montscha-You area in the north to Echternach in the south. Sepp Dietrich held command of the 6th Panzer Army on the northern wing. His mission was to mimic the 1940 route, bypass resistance, seize bridges, cross the Meuse, and race for the coast. But this was 1944, a world apart from 4 years earlier. The 5th year of war had ground Germany down. Cities in ruins, rail lines broken, factories missing crucial links, Allied planes combing the skies like a rake. To patch the ranks, orders went out: strip non-combat posts, conscript males aged 16 to 60, pull idle pilots and sailors into the infantry. From these scattered sources, the Volksgrenadier divisions were born, smaller than regular infantry but heavy with automatic weapons and Panzerfausts. On the battlefield, it meant more close-range firepower but less depth in formation. In the map rooms, the debate never ended. Rundstedt urged a cautious blow around Aachen, gnawing at an already worn stretch of the line. Hitler chose the long punch: break through encirclement, sever the ports. He put his faith in surprise, in the Ardennes fog, and in the belief that the enemy was thinly spread, guarding a forest the maps had long labelled difficult terrain. Reports from what was left of German intelligence networks in France, Belgium and the Netherlands painted a picture of weak defences, many US divisions newly arrived or just pulled out from the Hurtgen, still unsettled in their lines. In the northern wing, the 1st SS Panzer Division, the strongest formation of the 6th Panzer Army, was broken into several combat groups, Kampfgruppe. The spearhead column, commanded by Peiper, consisted mostly of the 1st SS Panzer Regiment and mechanised escort forces. About 100 tanks, Panzeroffiziers, Panthers from the division, together with 42 Tigers from Heavy Tank Battalion 501, were the steel mass meant to cut the way. The logic that put him there was simple: if you want to pierce through, send the sharpest knife first. He understood orders as a number to be met: speed. A few days before the guns opened, he drove the night route himself, an 80-kilometre run through the Ardennes' tight, steep roads, to prove they could move faster than the map. When the assault began, the ideal script was for the infantry to tear the line open while he funneled armour through the breach and roared down the Amblev Valley, the cold, damp gorge where every sound snaps back at the one pursuing. The roads were narrow, the turns tight, the grades steep, but to him everything was a variable to be broken by the rhythm of advance. Seen on the map, his spearhead's route cut across names that sounded almost benign: Malmedy, Stavelot, Trois Ponts. Below the hills and around the bends lay the 1st US Army's fuel depot, more than 2 million gallons of liquid that could turn his steel fortress into a feeding frenzy. If they could reach the bridges and cross, the Meuse would open up like a runway for a new gamble. At the macro level, the goal was to break the front and push toward Antwerp. At the micro level, his objective boiled down to 3 words: keep the speed. We do not need to see blood in this chapter. It is enough to see how he was positioned, why he fit that role, and the price others would pay when this knife was drawn from its sheath. The curtain about to rise at Honsfeld will reveal a spearhead that does not secure its flanks, that drives straight for the prize, the bridges over the Meuse. And at every bend, the only question is, can speed save him from what he carries with him? On the map, spread under the yellow lamp, a pencil drew a bold line westward. December 14th, 1944, at division headquarters, Peiper received his orders: seize the bridges over the Meuse at Huy, exploiting surprise to the fullest. There was still hope that the lead elements of the 1st SS and 2nd Panzer might reach the Meuse within 24 hours of departure. The expected distance was 75 to 95 miles. The driving force behind that gamble was a massive body of steel. On December 16th, the 1st SS Panzer Division stood at the top in strength, about 100 Panzer IVs and Panthers, plus 42 Tigers from Heavy Tank Battalion 501. The division could not advance as a single mass on the narrow roads. It split into 4 columns, with Kampfgruppe Peiper carrying most of the 1st Panzer Regiment, forming the spearhead. But the 12th Volksgrenadier Infantry had already failed Peiper. The day slipped away in the drone of idling engines. Worse yet, a railway line northwest of Losheim had been blown, engineers arrived late. By afternoon, the 12th Volksgrenadiers' horse-drawn artillery regiment was ordered forward, only to jam the road solid. Peiper himself had to go out and clear the bottleneck, pounding his hand on the steering wheel at what he despised most: delay. At 7:30 p.m., the Vanguard finally reached Losheim. At that moment, radio reports came in. The next overpass was destroyed. Engineers couldn't fix it in time. Turn west, toward Lanzerath. Night fell. At Lanzerath, the 3rd Parachute Division had not yet opened a wide enough path. Reports came back dry and cold as gravel. Time was gone, and his pride would not allow this stagnation to drag on. Then he made a quick decision. Piper pulled an infantry battalion, locked 2 Panthers into the lead, and closed the wedge. 4 a.m., December 17th, 1944. The fog fell like salt. Honsfeld woke to the low growl of engines. The spearhead of Kampfgruppe Piper surged in. The American outpost swept aside, the night watch not even buttoned into his coat, the whole village falling in minutes. Prisoners were rounded up at the edge of town, helmets piled at their feet, hands locked behind their heads. No argument, no negotiation. A short, dry order fell, and bursts of gunfire tore into the men who had already laid down their arms. Bodies toppled into the grassy ditch. A few steel helmets rolled as far as the fence, like stones knocked down a slope. It was not a random outburst. It was a link in a chain of prisoner shootings carried out that day by units under Piper's command. The follow-on columns passed through the killing ground without pause. Speed, the creed of the spearhead, was paid for with the lives of men who no longer resisted. There was no sign of hesitation. Gather them, march them, fire. Then the convoy rolled on as if bypassing nothing more than an inanimate obstacle. Piper was not the man squeezing the trigger at the ditch's edge. But he was the one who drove the blade into place, set the tempo for the entire battle group, accepted the price of moving faster than the map, and let that price fall on prisoners. In that logic, the laws of war were shoved to the roadside, replaced by a brutal discipline: seize the moment with bullets for men who had already raised their hands. Honsfeld was cold not only with frost, it was cold with the knowledge of what was permitted under Piper's command. Speed above law, orders shorter than conscience. From here, the advance of Kampfgruppe Piper carried 2 tracks: tank treads on the asphalt and bullet holes on the coats of men who had surrendered. Piper did not linger to count the dead. He flicked the signal with a curt order: shift axis toward Billingen. The reason: paved roads and fuel. Reports had already reached him: an American fuel depot near the crossroads. As expected, gasoline was found. Prisoners were forced to drag hoses, tank crews jostled for place, auxiliary tanks unsealed, raw fumes burning straight into their faces. The fuel gauges crept upright, the engines began to rumble deeper. The US Army's own records confirm the large refuelling at Billingen. Some post-war summaries estimate around 50,000 gallons, cited only as a secondary approximation. Across the road, a few American guns fired back. Shell casings bounced on the thin snow. The Germans pushed the pace like swimmers breaking the surface after a long dive. The Americans burned time by chopping bridges, posting anti-tank squads at the village edge. Both sides understood this was no longer a clean pursuit. It was a struggle for the last minutes between machine and man. When the last vehicles were filled, Piper snapped the caps shut and pulled the column toward Ligneville. The sense of slipping the leash blurred the gunfire still echoing behind them. Honsfeld was not the only blow. The chain dragged by Kampfgruppe Piper was not only steel tracks and fuel hoses, but a record of crimes, weightier than iron, as the days grew shorter. The sun rose another 2 fingers. At Ligneville, he reached into the web of roads, the branch toward Stavelot, the bend toward Beaugnies. Retreating American convoys left behind a tangle of jeeps, artillery pieces, and supply trucks like a spool of thread unravelling. Piper's column sliced through, severing the few strands of opportunity the enemy tried to pull west. Neither side had room for gestures. One needed fuel and bridges, the other needed time to torch depots and turn towns into strongpoints. The line between life and death was as short as the snap of a detonator cap. As his spearhead cleared Ligneville, the map shrank to one name, Beaugnies, where the road to Malmedy crossed like a small crucifix. There, at midday, Americans would stand still in a field, unarmed, and gunfire would answer every question. But that is the story of the next chapter. For now, Honsfeld had played its part, a breakfast of fire, leaving the smell of gasoline, mud, and gunpowder on the coats of the living. About 30 American soldiers were systematically executed after refueling the tanks and armoured vehicles. Another group of roughly 12 men was also shot dead, their hands tied above their heads as they were marched to the rear. Yet the more catastrophic events had not yet come. The road from Ligneville bent toward Beaugnies like a black cross on the snow. By noon, Kampfgruppe Piper's column collided with an American convoy trying to escape. The trucks of Battery B, 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, strung nose to tail, front and rear pinned by German fire, the harsh clang of metal cracking across the frozen road. When the lead vehicle went down, canvas covers flew back, men leapt from the trucks unarmed. They surrendered. In a withered brown field, the Americans were herded into a single controllable cluster, standing unarmed, ear flaps pulled down, their breath smoking in the cold. The sky held no aircraft, only the steady idle of German diesel engines ticking like a clock about to strike. The moment stretched tight, like a rope drawn to breaking. Both sides knew the laws of war. Prisoners were to be protected. Yet both sides also lived inside the raw game of survival. The Americans, looking down the road, saw endless tracks of armour. The Germans stared at their watches and fuel gauges sinking. The survival of the attack and the faith of the defence collided in silence. Then gunfire cracked, short, dense, flat. Bodies folded into the field. A few brown coats twitched, then lay still. History would call it the Malmedy Massacre, 84 American prisoners executed on the spot at the Beaugnies crossroads, December 17, 1944. Here, cruelty was not a sudden rage, it was a decision dropped as fast as a trigger pull, shielded by speed and the machine's icy detachment. The survivors, not many, rolled into the ditch, crawled into tree clumps, lay frozen until German tank crews' eyes slid elsewhere. They waited, counting heartbeats, hearing boots crunching in grass and steel tapping against rifles. A few escaped, moving toward Malmedy, first following smoke, then the smell of powder and the sound of English. A patrol from the 291st Combat Engineer Battalion would reach them around 2:30 p.m, muddy, shivering, their sentences broken by shock. Within 3 or 4 hours of the gunfire at Beaugnies, the Inspector General of First Army had the grim news. From those first reports, the wave of word spread like fire through dry straw. The SS takes no prisoners. The psychological impact travelled faster than any mechanized column. Along the Amblev-Salm line, where American platoons fought for towns like Stavelot, Stoumont, La Glaise, the whisper hardened the air. While engineers torched depots, artillerymen fixed coordinates, and infantry built barricades inside civilian houses, the news of Beaugnies put an extra bar of iron in their voices. The line between life and death in the Ardennes, already thin, became a thread. In that climate, the name Piper was no longer just a spearhead, it became a curse, a sign that stiffened American fingers on the trigger. Yet even for the attackers, Beaugnies marked a price that could not be avoided. Every minute spent gathering, corralling and shooting prisoners was a minute of fuel lost from Piper's gauges, a minute for the American defence to string barbed wire across strong points. Behind him, small bridges like Trois Ponts were being rigged with charges. Ahead, the roads from Malmedy to Stavelot began to clog with retreating and reinforcing vehicles alike. The evil did not stop at the count of 84. It carried lists of names, dotted maps, autopsy reports. It walked into prosecutors' chambers and sat down as a witness that could not be removed. Later, in the military tribunals at Dachau in 1946, numbers, names, times would be read aloud, and evidence would outweigh denials. On that December noon in 1944, however, it was only gunfire in a field. Survivors later recalled trembling, feigning death, waiting for a chance to crawl away. Their comrades who still lived listened and gripped their rifles tighter. The front changed colour, harsher, bloodier, less forgiving. When Kampfgruppe Piper left Baugny, the spear drove again to the northwest, toward names waiting to become strongpoints: Stavelot, Stoumont, La Glaise. Overhead, thick clouds still pressed low, holding back the P-47s from their bombing runs. On the ground, engines roared on. Both sides pushed toward their limits, the Germans to the limit of fuel and terrain, the Americans to the limit of nerve as they stood to hold the narrow gate. From Baugny, the spear of steel slid down the Amblève valley like an arrow loosed from a bowstring. The road along the southern bank was narrow, steep, winding. A thin crust of snow turned the asphalt into a sheet of glass. Ligneville faded behind. Ahead lay Stavelot, sloped roofs and bell tower silhouetted as dusk came early. On the outskirts, Piper's reconnaissance units spotted hundreds of American trucks jammed along the opposite axis. Many were hauling fuel stores from the Stavelot/Malmedy area, struggling up the inclines. Along the road, wheels spun in the snowy mud, curses echoing off the rock walls and back again. Opportunity and danger appeared together. The first blockade came like a pillar of fire across the road. At the junction, American officer Solis ordered 124,000 gallons destroyed on the spot, tank lids wrenched open, gasoline spilling like a black river, the torch flaring into a wall of fire. In the flickering glow, steel treads faltered for a beat. Some German crews abandoned vehicles, circling to find other paths, their throats choking on gasoline smoke. It was the only significant fuel denial the Germans encountered in this sector. The main depots Piper would never touch. Gasoline burned into hours, and hours were what the Americans were buying back with bullets. Beyond the flames, the town became a fortress. Stavelot, Stoumont, La Glaise were no longer points on a map. Every house a firing pit, every street corner a minefield. The narrow roads forced the German column into single file, with tanks at the head always meeting death first. Direct fire from windows, bazookas from hedgerows, grenades slapped onto tracks. German infantry had to slip through backyards, fences and porches. Engineers crawled flat to clear mines, marking each patch with scraps of cloth. Every metre of road cost hours. Every hour cost blood, both from German crews and from the American soldiers clenched in doorways. Both sides knew life and death, now measured by the tape carried in an engineer's pocket. By nightfall, German engines still growled, but in fits, swallowed at times by the crash of collapsing houses or the ripping blast of a shell. Across the line, American companies rotated supply runs through civilian courtyards, 105 shells, bandages, wax paper-wrapped bread. And then, amid the deadlock, the turning point came, not fast, not slow, but exactly on time. On December 22nd, the sky lightened as if a lid lifted. The fog thinned, the air cleared. From the west, the radial drone rose, tactical aircraft slicing in like kitchen knives, striking assembly points and supply lines around Stavelot-Stoumont. German ammo trucks burned, the veins of logistics severed. On the ground, American strength swelled. The 30th Infantry Division sealed the north bank of the Amblève, 3rd Armoured CCB hooked in with armour groups. The 82nd Airborne hammered down along the Salm, with the 505th PIR grinding into the Troyes Pont Grand Halleux line, throwing back every crossing attempt. Piper felt the noose tighten more in his radio than with his eyes. Every direction held American voices. The Trois Ponts crossing, hoped for as the bridgehead for heavy columns, was now only shattered concrete, black water swirling below. German night drops of fuel fell right into American hands at Stoumont. The thirst of the column was no longer a feeling, but a number on the dials, the needle sinking into the red. Speed, his worshipped tactic, bowed for the first time to terrain, mines, artillery, and an open sky. In the stone houses, nights at Stoumont stretched double. Squads shifted positions room to room, boring holes through walls for crossfire. German tank crews curled inside frozen barrels, counting 30 seconds between salvos to push 10 metres farther. By December 23rd, under a sun dull as scratched tin, La Glaise had become a pocket. Its trap was not in numbers, but in the shape of the valley. Pincers at every exit, charges at every bridge, ears in every wooded trail. Kampfgruppe Piper was heavy in both senses. Tanks, self-propelled guns, half-tracks choking the roads, a record of crimes dragging behind like a long shadow. The line between life and death was as thin as the ice on a church step. One slip and done. And with the fuel gauges bottomed out, the question was no longer how to move forward, but what to abandon to save the men. By late afternoon, December 23rd, 1944, in a cold room at La Glaise, a short order came down. Breakout. Moncke authorised Piper to withdraw from the trap. No flourishes, only the last way left to live. Outside, the axes of Stavelot-Stoumont-Trois Ponts had become jaws. Above, clear skies meant any heavy column that moved would be exposed. As night flooded the main slope, a second decision fell like stone. Abandon the weapons, save the men. Not enough fuel to drag an iron forge of armour out of the pocket. Each self-propelled gun, each Panzer, each Tiger was locked down, safeties pulled, demolition charges set. Crews laid hands on their machines, not to salute, but to check the fuses one last time. The badly wounded were left with the rear guard, painkillers split into half doses. Every motion was rationed, bandages, explosives, time. Even compassion had to be compressed like a spring. 0100, December 24th. A column of about 800 men slipped out of La Glaise in single file, each with a hand on the shoulder ahead, a black snake threading through the pines. They moved without lights, without voices, hearing only snow squeak under boots. At the forest's edge, the demolition group lingered last. A belated blast flung fire back into the town, giant hulks of steel collapsing in silence. The main body cut down to the Amblève, using ropes, pine branches, and their strongest men to pull each group across the black water. Freezing, slipping, gasping. Life and death were now half an arm's reach between the banks. One missed grip, one man gone into dark water. No one stopped. Time was the third enemy, after terrain and bullets. Before dawn, the column had slipped into the forests north of Trois Ponts, tracing the ridge like a streak of ink. At the village edges, they skirted each glow where American sentries held the doors. On the night of December 24th into the 25th, when the Sarm appeared like a wire of steel, they crossed the water again, this time stumbling into a patrol from the 82nd Airborne. A short, close clash followed, rifles firing within breath's reach. Then the column veered into a dark valley and disappeared among the trees. Near Christmas morning, the remnants of Kampfgruppe Piper linked up with elements of the 1st SS south of Stavelot. There were no cheers, only the warmth of the living touching one another. Each man knew he had spent the last of his luck that day. At that same hour, La Glaise lay hollow. On the morning of December 24th, American infantry poured into the town. They braced for resistance, but found only open doors and the stench of burned iron. Rows of houses sat in silence, like after a funeral. The arsenal of the spearhead lay abandoned in every corner. turrets still warm, tracks pressed into frozen streets. American soldiers moved house to house, breaking locks, calling out names. When they found pale faces trapped in cellars, the shouts cracked with cold. About 170 American prisoners, most captured at Stoumont since December 19th, stepped into the light, blinking like men waking from a nightmare. Nearly 300 Germans, many wounded, were taken at once, bandaged roughly with the enemy's own dressings. In war, there are moments when both sides breathe easier at a single phrase, still alive. Then came the inventory, a language dry but heavy as iron. 28 tanks, 70 half-tracks, 25 self-propelled guns left behind, many intact but out of fuel. Steel beasts that last night had demanded passage now reduced to wreckage. Together with those destroyed in battle or sabotaged on the road, the 1st SS Panzer Regiment lost the mechanical backbone of any supposed hammer blow. In the daily logs, those numbers ended the legend of the unsplintered spearhead. On the faces of the survivors, they carved years. For the Americans, that morning was no pure triumph either. They carried out their own wounded from stone houses, dragged fallen comrades across courtyards into collection points. They gathered usable ammunition from German half-tracks and redistributed it to platoons holding bridges. Life and death still stood pressed together, like two pages not yet turned. The pace of war allowed no holiday. The 30th Infantry, 3rd Armoured and 82nd Airborne had to keep the jaws locked, blocking every attempt at reunion from the east. Kampfgruppe Peiper still existed, in men. In materiel, it was nearly zero, and so the 1st SS could no longer be called a panzer division in any true sense. From here, the story was no longer about breakthrough. It was about consequence, trials to come, records to be opened, and the snowfields of La Glaise forever holding the tracks of a night when men abandoned steel to save flesh. When the smoke cleared from the valley, the battlefield left voids no voices could fill. At Borgnier, the thin snow was torn up, scraps of grass mixed with mud and the dried brown of blood. The body recovery teams came first, roping off the site. They collected shell casings, marked bullet scars in fence posts, timed photographs that needed no artistry. At the field's edge, a few survivors huddled, pointing with broken voices, shaken by cold and memory alike. Names, units, hours, every fragment was set in order. From here, Malmedy was no longer a story told, it became a case file. Witnesses testified. At noon on December 17, 1944, the convoy of Battery B, 285th FAOB, was halted at the crossroads. The Americans laid down their arms, clustered in the field. After a silence, gunfire burst short and heavy. When the 291st Engineer Battalion found survivors around 2:30 p.m, the account had already moved beyond personal horror into the notebooks of 1st Army's Inspector General just 3 to 4 hours later. The number 84 was fixed. 84 prisoners never returned. From then on, Malmedy was branded a place of atrocity, one word hardening every officer's voice in reports. After the campaign, investigations followed the path of Kampfgruppe Peiper, Honsfeld, Bühlingen, the places where prisoners were rounded up, herded and shot. Stakes marked coordinates, maps confirmed sites, timelines linked by villagers' testimony and unit records. A list of victims was compiled, names, ranks, service numbers. Medical reports noted bullet angles, estimated ranges and causes of death, cold numbers that did not lie. In those files, the name Peiper stood out, commander of the spearhead that led straight to Malmedy. Atrocity here was not painted with adjectives. It took form in procedure, capture, herd, shoot, move on. In 1946, the summer in Dachau was anything but mild. The Malmedy massacre trial, part of the Dachau proceedings, ran from May through July. A small courtroom, wooden benches, ceiling fans creaking softly. The defendants were Waffen-SS officers and men involved, among them Joachim Peiper. Witnesses stepped forward, an engineer describing how he dragged a wounded man from a ditch, a medic reading autopsy notes, a map with red slashes marking Kampfgruppe Peiper's advance pinned to the wall. The evidence was not only words, it was photographs of the site, handwritten orders, serial numbers of weapons. The same question repeated, who gave the order? And no matter how the answers circled, the chain of events drew back to the same point. The verdict came down like a hammer striking wood. Death sentences for some of the accused, life or 20 years for the rest. Peiper was condemned to death, but that sentence was never carried out. In the years that followed, storms of review over procedure and interrogation methods swelled. Sentences were reduced, commuted, adjusted. By December 1956, most of the defendants in the Malmedy case had been released, Peiper among them. What remained was the name. After Dachau, Peiper was no longer just the name of an SS Panzer officer. It became a marker for a chain of acts where prisoners had no way back. In training reports, in textbooks on the laws of war, and in Holocaust museums, Malmedy is cited as an example, not to tell a gruesome tale, but as a warning. The evidence was boxed away in files, but the wound remained, in cemeteries, in photographs of comrades, in the ragged breathing of men who had once feigned death in the grass. In the end, there was one thing justice could never do: erase. It could only record. And it recorded clearly that along the roads of Honsfeld, Büllingen, Baugnies, Kampfgruppe Peiper left its imprint not only in steel tracks, but in the names of 84 men and the grid squares of the investigators' maps. Those grids were straight, cold, precise, unlike the battlefield, chaotic and uneven, but for that very reason they locked a truth in place. Atrocity did not vanish into the fog, it sat fixed at coordinates that could be pointed to. This chapter closed with the seal of a court and a list read halfway through in a cold room. The next chapter would turn toward the post-war years, a man leaving prison, passing through factories and ending in fire. But with a name that never escaped the moral sentence history had written upon him. The doors of the Dachau courtroom shut, but the clang of their iron bolts echoed for years. Joachim Peiper left the chamber carrying a sentence heavy as lead: death. Lawyers argued, records were turned again and again, procedural reviews followed one after another until the sentence shifted. From death down to life, then to 35 years. What seemed the straight line of justice bent and kinked with the times. And by December 1956, when prison gates opened for most of the Malmedy defendants, Peiper too walked free, a shadow moving against the sun. Some believed darkness lost its power once dragged into the light of ordinary life. They were wrong. In a changed Germany, Peiper sought civilian work in the auto industry. Porsche, then Volkswagen, factories that prized precision, speed, assembly lines, the very watchwords of his old trade. But the name Waffen-SS was no ink stain that could be scrubbed away. It clung like the odour of an old uniform, making co-workers wary, the press growl, public opinion flare. For many, there was no engineer Peiper or employee Peiper. There was only Peiper of Malmedy. Each time he passed through the factory gates, the past entered with him, like a file no one wanted to hold but no one could discard. Anonymous letters, newspaper articles digging into his record, barroom arguments snagging on the name. That was his post-war life. He tried to bury it in silence, as though silence might substitute for confession. But silence is a sound of its own. It scratched at the nerves of those who remembered Honsfeld, Büllingen, Baugnies. It stirred the memories of families who still kept notebooks with the names of those who never returned. On one side, the numbers had been stamped in court files. On the other, the loss still lived like a family member, sitting at the dinner table, quiet while others spoke. The inhumanity of war did not fade when the guns fell silent. It lingered in kitchens, in the way people looked through windows before switching off the lights. Piper left Germany, seeking a quieter address on the map of Europe. Travers, in eastern France, where the Saône River curved beneath rows of trees. He lived quietly, changed his pace, avoided places where the past might be spoken. A small house, another name on a mailbox, a thin man pushing a cart through the market. But a dark legend cannot lose its trail. For some, justice had never been served. For others, history could not be trusted without a spark of fire. On the night of July 14, 1976, France celebrated Bastille Day. In Travers, fireworks bloomed in the distant sky. In Piper's wooden house, flames rose first in a corner, small, then widening like a beast's jaws, licking up dry walls. Smoke thickened quickly, clinging to curtains, hair, lungs. Neighbours heard the crack like bones snapping, rushed over. The door was locked. Windows glowed red. By the time fire brigades arrived, the house was ash. The body of a man was found inside, dead from smoke inhalation. Arson, that was the word written down. No names appeared in the files as they had in Dachau, no motives were read aloud as in a courtroom. There was only fire, and a black circle closed in the same element that had birthed it. People would argue still, was that death enough or fitting for what had happened in the fields of Beaune? The law has no answer, because crimes do not vanish with the death of their authors. They remain like a milestone reminding anyone tempted to make speed, a creed that every road exacts its price. If there was an inhuman truth in the war Piper carried with him, it was not only the bursts of gunfire into prisoners, it was the belief that the goal justified every means. From distant Huy to the burned house in Travers, that thread was never broken. In museums, the photograph of American soldiers standing in the field still hangs. In military academies, the lesson on the laws of war is still taught. In families where someone never returned, the empty chair still tilts the dinner table. Piper is gone, but the moral sentence attached to his name has no expiration date. It needs no prison walls or guard towers. It lives in the memory of those who survived. The darkness of that war has not gone out, only shifted places, from the battlefield to the printed page, from the courtroom to late-night conversations. And this time, everyone has a part. The teller, the listener, the recorder, and the names read slowly to the end. From a purely operational view, Piper's spearhead exposed the limits of frontal thrust tactics when logistics and flanking support could not keep up. In the Ardennes, bridges as thin as threads, roads as narrow as locks, terrain jagged as a saw blade, everything demanded tight synchronization between tanks, infantry, engineers, and artillery. One broken link and the whole chain jammed. Here, the links were fuel, bridges, and the sky. A war machine could thunder forward, but if the fuel gauge hit bottom and the clouds parted at the wrong time, it would halt like a useless block of iron. In the moral realm of war, the name Piper entered the books with a heavier weight. Malmedy was not an isolated episode. It became precedent for prosecuting war crimes against prisoners of war. The files and verdicts of the summer of 1946 still sit on shelves in academies and museums as a reminder that objectives never justify every means. In a disciplined army, a short order can kill from farther away than any rifle barrel. And for that very reason, the laws of war exist to bind such orders within limits. Looking back over the whole route, Honsfeld, Bullingen, Beaugnies, Stavelot, Stoumont, La Glaise, you see two lines overlapping. One is the line of advance, drawn with steel tracks, gasoline fumes, and artillery shells. The other is the chain of evidence, drawn with coordinates, bullet holes, and lists of the dead. The first line broke at La Glaise, the second stretched on to Dachau, then further still into textbooks and exhibits. If a short definition of Piper's legacy is needed, it is this: a military failure bound inseparably to a criminal record. The lesson for soldiers is pragmatic. A breakthrough exists only if supply holds, if the skies are not hostile, if terrain is not turned into a trap by engineers and artillery. The lesson for lawmakers and those who wear the uniform is moral. Prisoners are not raw material for momentum. A burst of fire into men who have laid down their arms may spare you a minute's trouble, but it will burn through years of honour for an entire force, and burn for decades in the memory of families on the other side. Life and death may be only a step apart, but right and wrong are sometimes just one order apart. That is why, when people recall Kampfgruppe Piper, they remember not only a spearhead that never reached the Meuse, they recall a metaphor: speed and brutality meeting organisation and limits, and losing. His battle group made it through the forest the night of December 24th, but it never escaped the judgment of history. 28 to 70 to 25 are not meaningless numbers. They are 3 nails closing the coffin lid on a legend of breakthrough. And 84 is not just a statistic, it is 84 reminders that law and morality are never accessories to war. We close the story here, not with an explosion, but with a warning. History rarely repeats itself exactly, but its mechanics often do. Whenever someone believes the goal allows every means, whenever someone raises speed to the level of religion, Laglaise and Bonnier will glow red again on the map of the mind like 2 warning lights. And in that cold light we hear a short sentence: "Do not cross the limit, for once crossed no victory is ever great enough to redeem it."